So here is our quick roadmap for today's advocacy masterclass. We'll cover the foundation, nonviolent crisis intervention, empowering grassroots, translating protest to policy, and finally expanding the scope. Let's kick things off with Module 1, the foundation. We've got to start by shattering some of those preconceived notions about his early life, just so we can truly understand the sheer intellect behind the movement. For starters, the man we know as Martin was actually born Michael Luther King Jr. in Atlanta back in 1929, only changing his name later on. But what's truly astonishing is his early academic capability. He wasn't just smart, he was a bona fide child prodigy. He was so brilliantly talented that he skipped 2 entire grades in high school. That means he walked onto the campus of Morehouse College as a freshman when he was only 15 years old. The strategic genius we see later in his life? Yeah, that was built on a remarkably sharp, fast-developing academic mind. And he certainly didn't stop there. He went on to earn a doctorate from Boston University, which, by the way, is also where he met his future wife, Coretta Scott, who was an aspiring singer at the time. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating, especially for anyone studying human behavior. Even though he grew up completely steeped in religion with a father who was a reverend, King was initially highly skeptical of Christianity. He didn't just blindly inherit his beliefs, he genuinely interrogated them. He deeply questioned his faith before finally embracing it and entering the seminary. That deliberate, heavily examined faith would become the absolute anchor of his entire life's work. Moving right along to Module 2, Nonviolent Crisis Intervention. Let's look at how all this builds into the core philosophy that drove his activism. Now, as future social workers, you know that before action comes theory, right? Well, King's foundational strategy for advocacy was directly inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. It was this strict, unwavering adherence to nonviolent protests, methods like calculated boycotts and beautifully coordinated sit-ins. But listen, do not mistake nonviolence for passivity. It was a highly active, aggressively disciplined strategy. It required an extreme, almost unfathomable level of personal and emotional control from every single person involved. We see exactly how intense this discipline was when it was put to the ultimate test in 1956. Picture this. King's own house was bombed. His wife and his baby, Yolanda, were inside. Now, thankfully, they survived unhurt. But the community's reaction was immediate and terrifying. An angry, furious crowd of around 300 to 500 people quickly gathered right outside his home. And they weren't just shouting. They were armed with guns, knives, shovels, and pitchforks. The situation was a literal powder keg, ready to explode into a massive bloody riot at any second. So King arrives at this chaotic, terrifying scene, and with nothing but his bare hands and his voice, he performs an absolute masterclass in crisis intervention. He simply raises his hand to calm the furious crowd. He miraculously diffuses the violent tension by telling the armed mob to go home, and, profoundly, that they must love our white brothers and sisters. He preached in that insanely volatile moment that to be truly free, one must forgive everyone and entirely lose the fear of death. He didn't just teach the theory of nonviolence from a pulpit, he lived it under the most extreme pressure you can imagine. Which brings us perfectly to Module 3, Empowering Grassroots. You know, history books love to focus on the high-level policy victories, the sweeping laws signed by presidents and the massive rulings handed down by Supreme Court justices. But your field teaches us something fundamentally different. It teaches us that macro policy is built entirely on the micro-bravery of grassroots foot soldiers. King knew that leaders don't make history alone. The movement relied on incredibly brave, everyday people acting as the true engines of social change. Take Georgia Reed, for example. She was a cook living in violently segregated St. Augustine, Florida, and she actually suffered from polio. When others were understandably terrified of being beaten by segregationists for protesting, she bravely volunteered to step right up. She led a march on her crutches. And her only condition? She insisted on going home first to change out of her cooking uniform. She boldly declared that if she was going to go to jail for her rights, well, she was going in her Sunday best. I mean, wow, this is the human face of advocacy. This is the grounded bravery that actually forces systemic shifts. Now for Module 4, Translating Protest to Policy. So how exactly does that localized grassroots bravery translate into macro-level legislative change? Well, it happens through sustained, organized pressure. After Rosa Parks was arrested, the NAACP purposefully chose King to lead the response in the Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955. And guys, this wasn't just a weekend protest. It launched a grueling, deeply strategic campaign of sustained nonviolent resistance that lasted for 381 days. Think about that. 381 days of everyday people walking to work in the heat and the rain, organizing carpools, and just utterly refusing to bend. And this brilliantly illustrates what we call the advocacy pipeline. You start with a local action, like the Montgomery Bus Boycott in '55. That sustained economic and social pressure forces a 1956 Supreme Court victory outlawing public bus segregation. That legal victory then builds massive national momentum, eventually compelling President Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is then followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's a chain reaction. Protest creates pressure. Pressure creates legal precedent. Legal precedent creates sweeping federal policy. That is how the architecture of change actually works in the real world. And finally, Module 5, Expanding the Scope. For our final module, let's examine the evolution of a community organizer and, sadly, the ultimate sacrifice required for this kind of work. To achieve all of this, King was driven by an absolutely relentless work ethic. Just between 1957 and 1968, he traveled over 6 million miles. Let that sink in. 6 million miles. He delivered 2,500 speeches. He authored 5 books and dozens of articles. He delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech to a historic crowd of 250,000 people from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And his impact wasn't just local, it was globally recognized. He was named Times Man of the Year in 1963, and in 1964, he became the youngest man in history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But doing this work meant living in constant, terrifying danger. He was jailed over 20 times. He was literally stabbed in the chest once. His family home was bombed. Yet despite these relentless personal attacks, he didn't retreat. Actually, he expanded his movement. As the Vietnam War intensified in his later years, King broadened his scope to focus on what he called the 3 major evils of society: racism, poverty, and militarism. He recognized that true justice requires addressing the intersection of all these deeply rooted systemic issues. You can't just fight one. This expanded focus on the intersection of labor rights and poverty is exactly what led him to Memphis in 1968. He went down there specifically to defend the rights of striking garbage workers. It was there, doing the on-the-ground community organizing he loved so much, that he delivered his final, intensely prophetic speech, famously titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And tragically, as we know, the very next day, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray on April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel. He made the ultimate sacrifice, but he left behind a legacy so profoundly impactful that in 1983, President Ronald Reagan actually signed a proclamation declaring the 3rd Monday of every January as a public national holiday just to ensure we never, ever forget his blueprint for justice. So here is the big takeaway for you. We've looked at the intellect, the discipline of nonviolent intervention, the reliance on real grassroots bravery, and the tactical pipeline from a local boycott to a massive federal law. Knowing that sweeping legislative change is born from organized, nonviolent foot soldiers like Georgia Reed and master strategists like Dr. King, how will you, as future social workers, apply these specific lessons? How will you pick up and carry this torch to systematically dismantle the evils of today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.